right, good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Keras Circle. Keras Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Keras Books, and Keras Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're very excited here tonight to welcome Daniel Ìgbín'Bí Coleman in conversation with Shania Cordes for a discussion of Refusals and Reinventions, Engendering New Indigenous and Black Life Across the Americas. In Refusals and Reinventions, artist, scholar, organizer Daniel Coleman considers his critical trajectories and participation in intersectional justice struggles in the US and Mexico, situating them within larger abolitionist and decolonial movements for Black civil rights and Native Indigenous sovereignty. They identify how Black and Indigenous people create, exist in, and reclaim many worlds, the pluriverse, through their artistic refusals and reinventions. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Georgia State University Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department. So we're very glad to have y'all here. Yes, represent. I'm glad to have y'all in the chat as well. So thank you. I'm going to introduce Shania Cordes first. Shania uses she, her pronouns, and is a PhD. She is a Black and Indigenous, Waru and Lokono anthropologist, professor, poet, and writer, currently assistant professor in the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. Her work explores the intersections and politics of Black and Indigenous peoples across the Americas and the Caribbean. Her forthcoming ethnography, Unsettling Geographies, Anti-Blackness, Gendered Violence, and Dispossession explores the co-constitutive relationships between anti-Blackness, gendered violence, and Indigenous dispossession in post-independence Guyana. Grounded in transnational Black and Indigenous feminisms, her work explores the openings and possibilities for rooted dialogue on liberatory land-water relations, sovereignty, and Black and Indigenous futures. She has articles published in Small Acts, Cultural Anthropology, and American Anthropology, along with published poetry in the Pariahs anthology, Raspa Magazine, and she recently co-authored a book, which we love here at Keras, Say, Listen, Writing as Care, as a member of the Black Indigenous 100s Collective. And the person of the hour tonight is Daniel Ìgbín'Bí Coleman, who uses he, they pronouns. Daniel is a Black trans artist, organic, intellectual organizer who traverses worlds and realms in his work and with his existence. They are committed to forging the worlds we need in the cracks and fissures of falling empires in the US South and the global South. As such, all of Daniel's work centers women, queer, trans, and gender nonconforming Black and brown people. He is proud to call the South home. He's also an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies and affiliate faculty in Africana Studies at Georgia State University. So we're very honored to get to help birth this book into the world and honor its existence. We know you have helped birth many students into the world and supported their scholarship. So it is always really special to get to celebrate the work of somebody who has helped so many others. So please, everyone, put your hands together and celebrate that.
So we're going to start actually with, I'm going to read a little excerpt of the introduction to ground us. So the introduction is called Para la Vida, or For Life. By means of introduction, the book in your hands or on your screen is a listening practice from several creative portals of entry. Through these portals, we will gain insights into ways of being/becoming and creating knowledge, thinking/doing, made possible only by acknowledging our many worlds. The book adds its voice to the scholarship aimed at challenging the modern world's quote-unquote algorithms of completion, the carefully calculated manipulations of congealed notions of human-made hierarchies and meanings for the purposes of modernity's own perpetuation, controlling who we are allowed to be and what we are allowed to know. Said differently, Refusals and Reinventions is an exercise in all that can be learned and gained by decentering some of the dominant, absented, and Euro-ethnocentric modern humanist delusions about superior and singular ways of being and knowing. We live for something else. In Refusals and Reinventions, when I refer to the many worlds within this one, I am referring to the concept of the pluriverse, offering my scholarship to the endeavors of other decolonial thinkers. I understand the conceptual work of the pluriversal way of seeing to be one of presencing and documenting some of the ongoing existences of our many worlds and their knowledge, life practices around the globe. As a form of practice, the pluriverse refers to, quote, heterogeneous world beings coming together as a political ecology of practices, negotiating the difficult being together in heterogeneity, end quote. Through pluriversal thinking and the pluriverse, we can re-envision being/becoming and thinking/doing in the face of the collapsing and endlessly mutating modern/colonial global neoliberal capitalist world order. One of the originating conceptual frameworks for the pluriverse relevant to this work comes from the Zapatista motto, un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, or a world in which many worlds fit. I think of the pluriverse within the parameters of this book as a framework for thinking about being/becoming and thinking/doing that recognizes the epistemological fact that people believe different things about reality, and the ontological fact that there are different realities being done in different practices, all within and beyond what we as a species tend to loosely call, quote unquote, the world. For the sake of clarity throughout the book, when I use thinking/doing, I'm referring to epistemology, and when I use being/becoming, I'm referring to ontology. A central question guides the selection of 4 creative case studies that we will use to address the more abstract philosophical conundrums of this pluriversal book. What are some examples of political and creative projects that demonstrate on the ground how we can practice something other than what is given to us within the enclosures of quote unquote the world, the purported singular totality that manages the operations of the present modern colonial global neoliberal capitalist world order for people not situated at the primary axes of power?
Thank you for reading that. I want to invite folks in this space as well to think about the invitation that your book offers us, which is to think about the roles that we walk with, that we carry within us. And so I want to just invite folks in the space, it's very intimate, folks online as well, to think about what are the roles and the knowledges that you're carrying, that you're bringing into the space. And I would invite you to share that with someone next to you, or you can drop it in the chat. So we'll just take 2 minutes to do that. Just a little audience participation, I think is great in a space like this.
Can you restate it one more time?
Yes, what kind of world, what worlds and what knowledges do you carry with you, and are you bringing with you into this space? It can be ancestral, it can be cultural place, or what knowledges and worlds are you carrying with you that you bring into space? Okay, folks, we're gonna invite you to wrap up your final thought. If you haven't already shared, please go ahead and wrap that up.
Can you repeat that?
Oh, yeah, I was saying that if folks are in the process of wrapping up, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Yes, I just love to kind of interrupt space a little bit in that way of the assumption that the audience is passive and does not participate, doesn't bring their own kind of experiences into the conversation. So thank y'all for participating in that as well. So, I mean, thank you for inviting me to be in conversation with you. This book is beautiful in many, many, many ways. I can see that you've written, which is a deep ethics of care for community, for Black and Indigenous communities specifically. And I think that this book is so necessary at a moment where in Black studies and Indigenous studies in particular, we are having deepening conversations about the specificities of those experiences of Black and Indigenous peoples, but also where the convergence is, right? Just in terms of the theoretical frameworks that we use, but also the kind of grounded practices and histories that we have had and that we continue to craft and make. And so I would love to just kind of hear you contextualize a bit for us, what was the journey of crafting that ethics and that politics of care as a writer and coming to this through your organizing, your performance work, and
So for folks who may not be less familiar with the book too, so the book, and I ended up dividing it into 4 case studies that were based on living and working between the US South and the Mexican South over a really concentrated period of 7 years, but really is about a decade of life. I had wanted to come back to the US South because where my father's family's from, in the DC, Virginia, Maryland, and he had fled the South in the 70s. You know, as somebody who was born in 1941, born into segregation, lived a lot of things and wanted to get the hell out of the South, and moved to California. And I felt a longing to actually be connected to the South as a territory. Somebody who grew up on the West Coast, I didn't feel, because we don't have any ancestry there, and I felt that absence. So going to PhD program at Chapel Hill was, I knew that I was leaving. I knew that that was it. And I, sold all my things and saved my money, packed my little car and drove cross country and knew that that was permanent. And so it was a bit different than just going somewhere because that's where the program is. I knew I wanted that to be a move. And so when I got into North Carolina, I got into organizing immediately. Started working with an organization called Southerners on New Ground, or SONG. And in the process of the doctorate, I continued. I have a long relationship with moving back and forth between Mexico and the US, having grown up in California, doing a lot of work with undocumented folks in particular. And I had initially gone to Chiapas in southern Mexico in 2007. as part of a different way of traveling. So it was through this group called Global Exchange, and it was super intimate. There were 4 of us. It was great because we all spoke Spanish, so there was only a need to translate between the indigenous languages in Spanish, and this was 2007. And so we were actually going into Zapatista territory and interviewing people about threats they were receiving. And so as an artist and as an organizer, I've always wanted to, particularly because of US imperialism and all of our extractive relationships, I've only wanted to be in other places in a particular way. So I got the chance to go back in 2013 as with Diana Taylor's Art and Activism summer school. And at that time, I was doing a lot of artistic work against femicide, the intentional killing of women because they're women. This was pre-transition for me too, so I was, queer woman moving through these spaces and entering into dialogues with folks about gendered violence, right? So in the context of that summer program, I met a woman who became a collaborator and partner who was already doing work on feminicide. And I did a performance that I had developed in another part of Mexico that summer. And so we just started collaborating. So we were accompanying family members who have lost women in their family. We eventually expanded that to include like trans folks, non-binary folks, and even indigenous men. And so we would stage public actions that were opportunities for family members to mourn this tremendous loss and horrific violence in a way that the state was never going to be able to address or had any interest in addressing. So at that point, I was moving back and forth between North Carolina and Mexico because of that work. And then after I got tired of the politics of the PhD program, I decided, if I'm going to finish this PhD, I need to get out of here. And I uprooted my life and moved to Mexico and just decided to be inside of the work. I didn't have a plan. I knew I was going to get through the PhD, but I wanted to be on the ground doing work and accompanying people appropriately. So then when I eventually moved back to the US, I got involved in, it was interesting watching like BLM rise while I was outside of the US and feeling this pull, like wanting to be there, wanting to be in the work. And so when I got back, I thought, my work isn't done in the South. I need to be in this abolitionist work. So that's kind of how the conversation began. And I thought, I was just doing this work because I'm drawn to do this work. This was not with the intention of writing a book about it, which is why I felt like I needed to write a book about it. My dissertation was something else entirely, and so this was really based on, what does it mean when we theorize from lived experience and theorize from community.
No, yeah, one of the things I told you about the introduction is that I just feel it's such a clear, engaging, beautifully written, and just ethically grounded introduction. And that's such a very difficult thing to do when you're bringing together these different geographies and histories and legacies. And so at the level of politics practice in writing, how did you decide what to keep legible and what to keep illegible? Especially in a book where you're writing about the pluriverse, right, or multiple worlds. That interrupts this notion that we live inside one social order.
Right.
How did you grapple with that?
Thank you for that question. It's I have to start with the introduction actually. So the acknowledgements. When I wrote the acknowledgements, and it was the last thing I wrote, and I thought about this and how many iterations of the introduction I had to write, both because of the complexity of my own positionality, wanting to ground the fact that this is all based on relationship. And that there are people who, in the process of writing this text that I'm no longer in relation to, that I had to thank because of the role that they played in my life, the role that they played in my work. And so there was some ways where I addressed this a little bit in trying to grapple with the we, and who is the we, and really understanding that doing political work, you're going to be surprised by people that you thought you had alignment with, that you don't. And some of that breaks down at the level of the interpersonal. And some of that breaks down, I think, with people who think they've worked through certain things that they haven't. And just how messy and challenging organizing work is. I think especially when it comes to, queer organizing and people start getting romantically involved with each other and then everything goes to hell. And then it's like, how do we come back to the work? How do we come back to the work? I'm really grateful for the concept of principled struggle, the time to lead, that when I was working with Song at that point, Mary Hooks was really talking about. And I think that concept has really helped around my decision to write about the things that I wrote about, even though I even had to go through like a mourning process of no longer being in certain collectives, no longer being in certain organizing work, either because I experienced, really challenging things, or I witnessed people experience such things that I could no longer co-sign by being involved. So that feels like, the part that I didn't want to get into, because if like we're inside of this work, we know, we know how hard it is, and the work still has value. I like to think, sometimes the work is smarter than us. There's like an energy of what we're fighting for that is worth it. Even if we dissolve some connections dissolve, some reconfigure, some you find unexpected allies along the way. So I had to write many, many versions, and I actually have various people's eyes on it because there was some earlier versions I realized I was being so apologetic or so over explaining myself, which, when you operate in a white supremacist context, the tendency is to over explain yourself, right? To feel like you have to defend what you're doing. And I was like, no, my people are with this work, so why am I defending? That should be positioning and locating.
And that's what you just said at the end there, positioning and locating versus defending. Is I feel like a thread that moves throughout the book as well. Is that this one world, as you write in the text, this kind of colonial / modern system that we live in, would like to give the impression, right, that is not the case, though, as we know it. So I feel as well very deeply in this book, and in chapter 3 in particular, you talk about it, in chapter 2, in grieving geographies, that there's a level of grief here, and in a political moment where we are dealing with so much collective loss and grief here and in other contexts of the world, what do you hope for us reading this book that we take away? What is the invitation for grief? Because then we do position grief not just as an experience, but something that is deeply important.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I've witnessed my own life and my beloved's lives. I hesitate to use this word, but derailed, quote unquote, in the thinking about institutional timeline, about things that have to get done. Because it never, the various things, whatever it is, whether it's physical loss of someone transitioning, or violence that you experience in your body, or for me it was a lot of like unprocessed trauma where I needed to take more time to write and to take care of myself and to strive for tenure, I hope that people feel an invitation to make the grief a practice, which I've also been inspired by my friend Gina Grayla at her opening here, and I'm specifically interested in how artistic practice can be that, like the detonator, that eruptive force that can kind of disrupt the other like war machine. I intentionally use that war language, because the twin of grief is rage, right? That the other side of that emotion. And I think so much of what we're seeing today of violence is like this so much unprocessed emotion. Yeah. So I hope that folks can find creative outlets, but individually and collectively, to feel things they haven't felt yet.
Yeah, I mean, this what you were saying about grief and rage, those are both things that are prohibited in this order. Those are very intense affective emotions that I think, as you put in the book, they're portals, right? And that's a very intentional word to use, a portal of wisdom, of medicine, as you say, the kind of entry points into these other worlds. How do folks cultivate, and these don't feel like you need to be prescriptive, but how might folks cultivate a practice of grief, like as a practice in a world where those are emotions that are specifically targeted and prohibited from happening and being held by our collective communities?
I think going back to, I think the solution, that some of the answers, so to speak, in these larger contexts where we can't grab onto or see any way to solve the myriad complexities that's just gone too far. What we can create in intimate spaces, the spaces that we can hold for each other. Because even with all the messiness and fallouts and things that I mentioned earlier, I still think those are the spaces where, in order to create a practice, you have to also open yourself up to a specific type of witnessing and finding the people that can witness and hold you in a mutualistic way, like creating new collectivities. I think that's the key to developing a practice where you actually get to feel the things and not do the posturing of, well, I have to be this person. The posturing of compartmentalization that we're asked to do all the time.
Yeah, and then I think too, what's really beautiful about the text is that you talk about the specific position of queer and trans folk at the helm.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear you talk more about that, especially as we're talking about the pluriverse and the kind of rupture and the breaking into these new worlds that trans and queer folks have always been at the helm and continue to be at the helm. Would love to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah. So one of the things that, it was interesting because I started my gender transition 10 years ago in the context of Chiapas, and I was doing, feminist organizing, and Mexico can be, and a lot of my friends would also agree, like there's a lot of turf, politics to feminism in Mexico, which I also feel some compassion for, given the rates of femicide, for example, but so doing a lot of organizing and conversations and teachings and wrestling it out with people of women, queer and trans folks, we need each other. And the idea that we don't, or the idea that our separation will be beneficial to anyone is really scary to me. And so I wanted to start there and think about okay, we're struggling, we're having a hard time, sometimes even liking each other. But at the end of the day, we hold the type of leadership. There's a vision that we have. And something that I've seen in, my friendships and relationships with other trans people is we're really in a moment of reclaiming who we are spiritually in this time. And so there's to me, there's an aspect of queerness and transness in particular, and the gender nonconformity that is a type of portal, a type of access, because you're moving between these, energies and politics and socialities that completely shift how you move through the world. And all of that heightened awareness, when you allow it to not just be like a trauma response or hypervigilance, if you can get to the other side of that, you realize the power. And I think that's part of what is going on politically right now for us too, right? Like, oh, trans people are scary. I'm like, yeah, they recognize our power. And that's so scary as shit. So I wanted to think about, trans and non-conforming in particular as a type of stewardship of these other worlds, because can be another perspective, another portal of entry that questions binaries in all its forms,
right,
and questions neat lines and prescriptions, and this is how it has to be, this is how it must be, this is how you look. When you start to let all of that fall away, and being in conversation with other people who are letting that fall away, I noticed there's some wisdom that comes with that, in other spaces. And so I think the idea that the world must be dominated by this like male patriarchal order, there's such a reactivity to that right now, because there's so much strength and power in realizing the fictitious nature of that order. So
yeah, I think this in particular for me with the question of queer and trans stewardship, especially in a moment of retrenchment of cis heteropatriarchal violence that is so specific and so targeted and is currently being bolstered by law, policies. What is it like? What is required to protect this space? What is required to, I think, protect the space of queer and trans folk that are doing so much of this work of trying to open a new way of seeing and being?
Yeah.
Because I think that's the flip side to it, right? Is that if someone's at the helm, there also has to be a holding that's happening as well. So how did you kind of navigate that in your work and also in writing the book?
Yeah. Such a great question. Many thoughts. I don't believe that policies or government or any of this is coming to save us, and so the idea of we keep us safe, I think, is so crucial to this work, and also no celebrities. I'm very committed to that, like where people can be at the helm, to mark a particular type of like, what does it mean for a trans person to open this, right? But nothing to do with the politics of exceptionality or inclusion. Like, this is something else. This is, so to me, it's like there are ways that we are ensuring our continuity. So for example, Leah, the third chapter is about, my trans sister. We have such a commitment to one another. And one of the things that she gifted me with after the residency and elsewhere, Mexico is the second most dangerous place in the Americas to be a trans woman. And so, and now she's 34, so she's about to cross that famous age threshold. And so we've been accompanying one another's journeys for years, and we made a commitment to see each other every year, and we do. And so what she gifted me that year was, she said, I never know if this is gonna be the last time I see you. I was like, oh no, please don't do this to me. And so she had left something on her bed, and I had taken her to the airport. When I came back, she had left her transition documents, a copy of them, from Mexico. And she said, I distribute my archive amongst my friends so that if anything ever happens to me, we all put it together. And so I think there's this like collective distribution and acknowledgement of the reality and how we are creating safety and creating sanctuary, and creating that, like, you know, actually being one another's family, actually being the people who are going to show up. I think that's how we have to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oof. Yeah, I think too, alongside this, these case studies, they reveal much about care work, the unevenness of care within our communities, but also how we can craft different ways of care labor, right? And so that's what I hear you saying very, very clearly right now. I think too about what you've also invited us to consider in the book around spirituality. Because so much of our politics, our organizing work can render that tangential, peripheral, marginal. And so what has that been like in your organizing spaces where spirituality is so much, I see, a part of your practice, a part of your politics, and at the level of writing as well?
Yeah. Well, I make clear in the work, you know, which is important to the work, that in the process of particularly coming back, it was right after coming back from the U.S. into the U.S., coming back from Mexico into the U.S., I became a Ìgbín'Bí practitioner, and I'll stay here with you today. And that cosmology and that way of existing, shaping everything about me and everything about my existence. And it really gave me a perspective on the lack of spirituality in a lot of, particularly in the US, but, well, no, in most spaces, a lack of spirituality because it would make us treat each other differently. And what I see going wrong with a lot of political work is there's a mistreatment of one another when we don't align. You know, or when we think someone's politics aren't as advanced as ours are, you know? Where it's like, well, how does somebody get there? Not from treating them like crap. Like, that's an old paradigm. That's the, you know, beat the shit out of the kid until they're scared and in agreement, right? Yeah, and that's the approach we take with each other. And so with spiritual practice too, for me, it's been such a, especially as like a Black queer and trans person, it was like realizing the depth at which I did not love myself, which will have you in spaces dealing with behaviors that when you actually have self-regard and respect, you know, you start to really bristle at that treatment of other people and of yourself. And so our political spaces, if they really want to be, you know, in spiritual, you know, have a spiritual alignment with them, it's not a kumbaya, it's not a, you know, because when I think about deities like Orisha, you know, like, whew, you gotta have a spine to listen, you know, to hear what they have to say to you. But so it's not this, like, you know, it's like that difference between being kind and not nice, right? Like, how can we allow people to be where they are, you know, so that we can struggle politically to reach, you know, so much of it is about the consciousness that we're trying to come to, the message that we're trying to get across, and, you know, trying to teach people to bring them somewhere different so that our reality can be different. But so often we stop short of like the broader public because we're fighting with each other. And so that spiritual piece for me allows for us to actually see how we're treating it, how we're showing it for ourselves. So then how are we able to show it for other people differently? And so there's so much like trauma work that needs to happen before people are fighting each other in a room, you know, or on the street. Like, until you've done that work, or until you're committed to doing that work as part of your daily practice, I don't see how political spaces can be as effective. And so the spiritual to me is like, it's that mirror of what's your part. And I think a lot of people are not ready for that and don't want to work.
Yeah. It is, you know, I think for me anyways, reading the book, the chapter for Olivia Garcia really resonated for me because you talk about the body as a vehicle, as a conduit, but there was something about the way that you wrote this chapter, the performance, was it Cocinar
La memoria.
La Memoria,
Yeah.
Cooking Memory.
Yeah.
That is just such a beautiful invocation of our connection, our visceral touch,
Yeah.
you know, the feelingness of it,
Yeah.
that I think really speaks to, I think, some of the fear that we might have around kind of encountering one another in these deep ways that require us then to, as you were saying, to reflect on our practices, reflect on how we show up in the world, and then hopefully hold ourselves to a different kind of accounting to one another. Yeah. And that's, you know, that's a very difficult thing, but also a journey that I think has to be continually centered in the process. And that's what comes across as well when you're talking about Black and Indigenous cosmologies and practices, and that is part of the work that cannot be on the periphery of what we're trying to do. So thank you for that. I do want to ask how much more time we have for me to ask questions, and if it's a moment to invite the audience to, whether online or in the space.
So I think maybe another 5 minutes of questions from you, and then we'll open it up.
Great. So I want to talk about a little bit about otroas. So this is a term that you use in the book, and a concept that has come up from the ground as well, that really thinks about those that are gendered otherwise, and how we can take our direction from that. So I would love to hear you talk more about how you came to the concept, how you're thinking about that in relationship to Black and Indigenous coalition and solidarity as well.
So pluriverse is a concept that comes from Zapatistas, which is a group of Mayan descendant revolutionaries in southern Mexico, and they really only started using it, that I heard publicly, about 2016. So they do a lot of public teaching, and so when you live in Chiapas, you'll go to a lot of this. There's just a lot of like public intellectual life, and so you'll go to these seminars, and when they greet everyone, they used to just say compañeros and compañeras, which is a play on words of theirs, because it's like between comrade and companion, because of, you know, so Marxist, Leninist origins of a lot of Zapatista organisms. But they started saying compañeros, compañeras, compañeroas. And I was like, So when that started happening, I was like, this is cool. I still live here. This is happening. Okay, you know, like queerness and transness is infiltrating Zapatismo. You know, that was my first thought. And I was like, well, and they have received a lot of criticism with particularly Europeans and Westerners going into community and feeling like the gender dynamics were really rigid. But they've never turned, from my knowledge, like turned people away or ostracized them for being gay or lesbian or queer or trans, because they don't hold the particular dogma or creed as part of their like decolonial position. And so Otroa, I think, really speaks to a lot of the indigenous, you know, history of Mexico. I think about like the Muxe and Oaxaca, and that reclamation of a third category, not to say gender or sexuality, because it can kind of be a lot of different things. Right. And it's also their intention with not using Western language to talk about other genders and sexualities, and just letting it be, and letting it be indigenous, you know? So, and Otroa as a language, you know, using the colonizers' language too, which is so interesting because in English it really doesn't translate. When you see the words, like the Zapatista communiques in English, it'll say other. I'm like, no, that's not. It's not an othering. It's no, an otherwise existence. Yeah. So, I think this Otroa space is such a conversation with a lot of what's happening in Black trans thought in particular. and reclamation of various spiritual, like I was part of the Black Trans Prayer Book, and so there were a lot of folks talking about, all of these different Black trans folks reclaiming or coming to various spiritual practices and, being diasporic or being, Black American, whatever, like not having access to other languages, like, Indigenous folks reclaiming like Two-Spirit and some other, and words that are specific to their people. And so Otroa for me was an opportunity to have that Black Indigenous conversation of stewardship, especially because the action that I talked about in that chapter, the Zapatista decided to do a performative reverse colonization of Spain. And so it was during the pandemic, they prepared and sailed in a boat from Mexico to Spain, and they had an Otroa Zapatista on board. And they made sure that they were going to be the first person to set foot on Spanish soil, and the significance of that, right? And to also reclaim the land instead of claiming the people. And so I was thinking about, how did the Black Atlantic become this like Black Indigenous Atlantic, Black queer Indigenous Atlantic? It's like, oh, they're doing so many things, and we can see what's happening as long as we allow our imagination to think about the entirety of that space, those geographies, the water, what's below the water.
Do you have time for one more?
Go for it.
Because there's just so much about this text, and there's just so much that you write about, and I really want to give space and time for you to talk a little bit about the kind of central mediums of art and performance and your creative work in all of the spaces that you've moved in the South dialogue. Like, what about the performative has allowed you to convey things that a book, right, might not be able to do or has not been able to do?
Yeah, I love that question. So I've always been more attached to performance work without language. And that's probably because I grew up as a dancer. I was extremely shy, neurodivergent, and all the things, so I was like, don't make me speak, but I will dance in front of thousands of people, no problem. And so I was always drawn to mediums that were able to transmit and teach and create conversation that didn't require the use of a dominant language. And I think in a space like Chiapas with these public interventions, and I miss public interventions. I think spaces outside the US, it's so much easier to just roll up and use all sorts of things and then disappear, and just stage an intervention.
Yeah.
I feel like here, the chance of the police coming and or somebody calling, it's so different. The surveillance, you feel the surveillance in your body. And so what that space, particularly working in Mexico, allowed was such organic and unspoken connections and conversations with people that you encounter in everyday life. And, that cut across class, or cut across age. Some of my favorite encounters were kids. There are a lot of kids who are working as street vendors, right? That aren't going to school. And so you get to engage them, with images, and sometimes they'll ask questions or they'll participate in actions. And it's like, there's such a different opportunity for public pedagogy for me, with that kind of artistic making that I wish was more accessible here in a really public way. And then I've always been very interested in, especially moving out of dance and into performance making, how we use our bodies, how porous our bodies are, which I think COVID really exposed that porosity, but spiritually porous, politically porous, socially porous, and what does mean, and in such a mediated societies, I really love the body and flesh, in space together, because it's different. It's just different. It'll never be the same than mediated space. And so what happens when we're in those exchanges and that interchange of information, just by what is brought up in folks when they see an image or they watch an action, or they, the way that I think about performance staying alive by the ways that it haunts people's memories, shifts, their feelings, shifts their perspectives. And so I really pulled on different types of performance and action work. That's the work that I've been really committed to over the years, where there's no fourth wall. And, Leah used some language, but ultimately her presence and the objects and animating objects, that's what was holding space, not what was creating the dynamic. So yeah, performance is definitely movement, action art. And then I look at the Zapatista action, because that to me is a performance action. So we're really going to colonize, right? But that's a pretty significant decision. Not easy on the body, People who are not used to being at sea.
For weeks.
Yeah, for weeks. Yeah. So, and people who, oftentimes, their Spanish is not on the same level as, their original languages too. So navigating that, I think the body is really powerful in that, not relying on the text, So then writing about it becomes a whole other thing, right? Because to me, this work does do the work it needs to do. And so writing about it is not a way to justify. For me, writing about it is a way to archive and to unfurl and open up all that some of this work is doing.
And as pedagogy too,
As pedagogy,
right?
yeah.
Because, as I was saying to you before we started our conversation, just even reading about Leah's piece was just very visceral, like the way that you were able to even translate that to text, which doesn't lend itself again to the level of complexity that I know must have happened in space. But there was something about the ability to kind of describe and invite the audience, the reader, into that moment that can also work to impact the body as well.
Exactly, yeah, especially because so many of these performance pieces they're intimate, they're small, and that desire for other people to get to witness, even if it is, after the fact, or to access the images, to imagine yourself in that space and let that do something to you.
Absolutely. So I will open it up for folks in this space or online. Any questions?
So if folks want to raise their hand, I will bring a mic to you. And we do have a comment from Stephanie Y. Evans. Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Some of y'all know Stephanie. As you know, words and images are so important. Can you tell us more about your process of choosing a title and cover art? What compelled the choices you made, and what was left on the cutting room floor?
Okay, so this title was very much a collaboration between me and the editorial board. I had a very different title, but they were like, we need to get to it. It was For Life was in the title, because I wanted to, in all of these regimes of death, I wanted to study life. And so then I was just like, okay, so be the name of the title of the intro. It was For Life, something like pedagogical lessons from the pluriverse. But it didn't say anything about Blackness or indigeneity, and so they were like, okay, let's start taking language out of the text, And so it was really a back and forth. And at first I was like, that's a mouthful. It's like, damn academic text. I was like, no, and then it grew on me, so it was really kind of a negotiation. But it gets at, the through line of the book is what I want.
It definitely does.
Yeah, and I appreciate that Refusals got centered, because I move away from the language of resistance.
Yeah.
And I can talk more about that. This cover, y'all.
It's beautiful.
If you do not know the artist Sabotage, go follow them. Follow them on Instagram, support their work. So they are a queer Muslim Southeast Asian artist who was also an artist at Elster Museum. And so we had been like adjacent community members for years in Durham and Greensboro. And I saw another cover they had done for Sociology edited collection. And then I had seen their work, the collage-based work. And so I said, will you make a piece of art for me that I can use for the cover? And so this was like back in 2019. We had 2, video conversations. I sent them a bunch of writing. I described the process, and I said, you have, as from one artist to the other, you have full artistic liberty. And I can't wait to see what you come up with. And I'm going to pay you what you're worth and use university funds to pay you. And voila. So they're amazing. They're amazing. And yeah, they recently did some really beautiful work about mourning Palestine as well. So I encourage folks to just check out the
Thank you for sharing your journey with the text of this. Can you tell us a little bit more about where you're headed next?
Yeah. So, it's though a lot of the work is about life, and how we create space together. I'm really scared, y'all. I'm really terrified of where things are going climatically, politically. I feel not a lot of hope for collective humanity, to be totally honest. I think just things are going to shift in our lifetimes in ways that we can't even fathom right now. And when I start really listening to the scientists, I get very terrified. The entire areas of the world are going to be underwater in the next 10 years. So I'm really interested in spending time in this question of cosmology and really conversation with Alexis Pauline Dems's work, especially what she did in M Archive and thinking about, if and when there are no remnants of, human life left, what is left in the cosmos? What are the energetic imprints? Because I'd like to think that there are other, in a more kind of multiverse way, and also thinking about with Octavia Butler. So I'm really thinking about this Afro-futurist, getting into some physics, which I'm not studied in that, but I might have to study up on, to understand cosmologically and scientifically and spiritually speaking, what are the imprints that we are leaving with the way that we live our lives, even if the earth swallows us because of our behavior. Yeah, that's where I want to go next.
I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about how Octavia Butler has shaped your thoughts of the future.
Can you tell me the last part of your question about Octavia Butler?
Has shaped your thoughts about the future and where we're heading.
Octavia Butler is the truth. I haven't read all of her texts, and I feel like I'm meant to finish all of her texts, especially because a lot of community members of mine doing Black land stewardship work have really turned to Butler as an example. So I think she's been so prophetic, and this, what's been really influential about Butler for me is the imagination, and how much we can limit ourselves when we don't imagine, which also makes me think I've been really influenced by Sylvia Wynter, which is probably obvious. But one of the things of hers that thoughts of hers I really hold on to related to Butler and this creativity piece, features and pieces, one of the great catastrophes of our species, I think, is, I look around, I look at all the things that we've created, I look at the technology, all the things that we have access to now, both because of our extraction and colonialism, but also because of our creativity and our capacity to harness energy and power. And, how is it that we've come so far in this one way, which is how I understand one of Winter's major arguments, but cognitively, we're not caught up with all of these other advancements. We haven't evolved to a point where we can see each other as existing as part of the same species, and therefore care about our longevity and care about each other. So for me, Octavia Butler is a reminder that the imagination is actually the beginning. You know, if you like, there are so many things that people just imagined that then became, which we abuse our own power so deeply. You know, it will be our undoing. But that imagination space for me is like, well, that's where creativity is. Not just, it's the creative, but it's also creation force as this ungendered force. You know, that we need to be harnessing more than destruction, but we're not. You know, it's choiceful, it's our fault. Yeah, so.
Hi, thank you so much for this kind of conversation that you had, and for sharing so much of you with all of us. So many things that I'm thinking about, but something is how you're gifting us a way to define ourselves, especially people that have these different words. And recently I've been in this conference where trans and Afro-Latinidad is being connected. So I appreciate how you are connecting Blackness in the south of the US with indigeneity in Mexico, but also it can be connected to any place in Latin America. Especially for people that, for being Afro-Latinx, feel like they don't belong into Blackness or into Latinidad, like trans people do. When people tell you you have to choose one or the other, you can be both. This makes me think about the concept of Americanidad, of Lelia Gonzalez. So I wanted to ask you, I know that you already share your work in many spaces already, in Texas, in North Carolina, so students have heard that from you. And I wonder if they're already interpreting your work in so many ways, because I think you can create so many connections. This solidarity that we are talking about is so important. So, and you told me that you use this concept in your book, so I wanted to hear more about how you applied it to the work.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So, for a long time, I've been hearing scholars, turn to Abya Yala instead of Latin America, which is a Huna word that means land in its full maturity, because to talk about, all of the Americas. Let's exclude the US and Canada from all of that. To talk about all of the Americas as Latin America, I mean, how much more colonized does it get, And so I've been really interested in learning how people are reclaiming, other names. And so as I wanted to do more research about Abya Yala's, birth, and then discovered this Afro-Indigenous Brazilian woman, Lelia Gonzalez, who was borrowing from another scholar and calling it América Latina. And so América, bridging Black Americans, like African American, right? América. And Latina, in the context of Brazil, reclaiming indigenous history from Portuguese and Dutch colonization. And so instead of calling, I was like, well, what am I going to call what am I going to call Latin America now? So I say Abya Yala South and / América Latina. And Abya Yala South because the term Abya Yala initially was from South American indigenous folks, but who were talking about all of the Americas, so from Canada, to the bottom. But I was like, América Latina was not trying to talk about the US and Canada. And so wanted to honor, indigenous and Black ways of trying to, negotiate a relationship to a geopolitical space that has just experienced such atrocious, violence from indigenous genocide, transatlantic slave trade, and all the modern iterations that continue to exist.
I thought that was just amazing.
Oh,
By the way, I didn't mention it, but thank you for that question.
We have one last question.
Hello, author. Okay, so I've been working on this question. What does the pluriverse of your transness teach you about Black femininity? What is one thing that you can share And I'm asking a question like that because in class you said, I did live my life as a Black woman and I'm now a trans man. And that is a pluriverse.
Yeah.
But what has it, through your eyes and lived experience, what is the one thing you can share with us that it has taught you about Black femininity?
This is such a good question. So many things. It's been a lot of Black and really Africana scholarship, that has made clear, thinking about like Hortense Spillers and some other folks, that, there's a particular type of ungendering, especially for Black women, because of the transatlantic slave trade. Like that history to me is something that has like deeply impacted me, and also because I come from my whole life is full of matriarchal lineages, whether it's whether it's ancestral, whether it's spiritual, and so there was something for me about my racialized, little girlhood and racialized womanhood that I have experienced things nobody can take away from me, and it has created a type of, I can't imagine giving up a solidarity or relationship with Black women and femmes. Like that's unfathomable to me. Because of all of these things, not just because of my lived experience, but because of the history. So for me, and I have experienced, unfortunately, in certain spaces like younger organizers, who get like angry at an elder who will be like, well, I'm 70 years old and now I have the language for non-binary. Like, how dare you, that's our language and da-da-da. I'm like, no. That's not the kind of space I'm interested in being inside of. So for me, there will always be something radical about Black womanhood. And maybe that's gonna make me old school eventually, I don't know. But it's still such a space to claim, and not from a space of like trans antagonism or like, those things don't have to coexist in my book, because there's a different historical register. And if we try to talk about it within other historical registers, we're doing more erasures. And kind of goes back to what I learned in these like Black and Indigenous organizing spaces, where unfortunately Black folks in the context of Mexico, we were a minority, which was part of the problem. But if there's anything I've learned about Black femininity or Black women, it has been the Black women in my life who have been the greatest affirmers of my transness, of my existence. And I'm talking about elders, I'm talking about, and so this idea that Black womanhood is at odds with inherently or necessarily to transness is just not true. It's not true for historical reasons, for political reasons, for interpersonal reasons, for, the women who held down all the things. So, all that,
I think that's a beautiful place to wrap up in our feminist space. I appreciate that. So I want to encourage our folks who have been watching online. Thank you so much for being with us. You can click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Refusals and Reinventions from Karis. So go on and do that. We do appreciate it when you buy your event books from us. It really does help us very much. So thank you.